For thousands of years, humanity believed one brutal rule: food is limited. Crops fail, rivers dry, empires starve, civilization rises and collapses based on harvest seasons. Drought meant death, flood meant ruin, war meant famine. And yet, more than 2,400 years ago, one civilization quietly engineered a system so advanced, so efficient, and so sustainable that it appeared to break this rule entirely. It didn't depend on rainfall. It didn't collapse during drought. It didn't exhaust soil. It didn't even require animal fertilizer in the traditional sense. It was a food machine, continuous, regenerative, self-sustaining. To outsiders, it looked like magic. To rulers, it looked like power. To conquerors, it looked dangerous. This system emerged during the height of the ancient world, around the 4th century BCE, the era of Alexander the Great, when empires were expanding and agricultural dependency determined military strength. While Mediterranean civilizations relied heavily on seasonal grain farming, in another part of the world a radically different approach was being perfected. In the Valley of Mexico, long before European contact, the ancestors of what would later become the Aztec Empire were developing something extraordinary: floating agricultural cities. They were called Chinampas. At first glance, Chinampas looked like small rectangular islands floating on lakes. But they were not islands in the natural sense. They were engineered land, artificial, layered platforms constructed from lake sediment, aquatic vegetation, and woven reed fencing. Farmers would drive wooden stakes into the shallow lakebed, interlace branches between them to form a retaining wall, and then layer mud, decaying plant matter, and nutrient-rich silt on top. Over time, this built up fertile rectangular plots surrounded by canals. Trees were planted at the corners to anchor them permanently. What appeared to float was actually rooted, stable, permanent, expandable. But here's what made them revolutionary. Unlike traditional farming that depleted soil nutrients year after year, Chinampas constantly renewed themselves. The surrounding lake acted as a natural fertilizer system. Nutrient-rich sediment accumulated in canals. Farmers would dredge this sediment and spread it across the fields, replenishing minerals continuously. Crops could be harvested up to 7 times per year in some conditions. Maize, beans, squash, amaranth, chilies, all thriving in rotation. It was polyculture before the word existed. Companion planting was standard practice. Ecological balance was built into the system, and the yields, unmatched. Modern agricultural historians estimate that Chinampa farming could produce several times more food per acre than conventional European medieval agriculture. Some studies suggest productivity levels comparable to modern intensive organic farming, without synthetic fertilizer, without tractors, without irrigation pumps. It fed cities. Specifically, it fed one of the largest cities on Earth at the time, Tenochtitlan. When Spanish conquistadors led by Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519, they expected to find scattered villages. Instead, they encountered a metropolis rising from a lake, connected by causeways, lined with markets, temples, and residential districts. It rivaled the population of Paris. Some accounts describe marketplaces serving tens of thousands daily. Fresh vegetables, fish, flowers, maize products, abundant and constant. Spanish chroniclers were stunned. How could a city built on water feed itself so consistently? The answer was the Chinampa network, thousands of interconnected agricultural platforms surrounding the city like a green engine. Food did not travel hundreds of miles. It moved across canals by canoe. Harvested in the morning, sold in the market by afternoon. No drought crisis, no soil collapse, no food deserts. It was, in many ways, an infinite food loop. But there's a deeper layer to this story. This wasn't just farming. It was ecological engineering. The lakes of the Valley of Mexico, including Lake Texcoco, created a unique hydrological environment. Instead of draining swamps, the system embraced wetlands. Biodiversity flourished. Fish and waterfowl thrived. Waste from the city could be composted and reintegrated. The line between urban and agricultural blurred completely. This was sustainability before industrialization. This was circular economy before capitalism. This was regenerative design before climate change. So why don't we see this system everywhere today? Why did it disappear? Why was it effectively dismantled after conquest? The answer isn't environmental failure. It was politics. After the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, Spanish authorities began reshaping the region according to European models. Lakes were drained to prevent flooding. Colonial cities were built in stone, not water. The Chinampa system, which depended entirely on shallow interconnected lakes, began to suffer. As drainage projects intensified over centuries, water levels dropped. The ecological balance fractured. But there was another reason. Chinampas empowered local populations. They were decentralized, community managed, highly efficient without large landowners. They didn't require feudal estates or monoculture plantations. For colonial powers focused on tribute, extraction, and large-scale livestock grazing, this system was inconvenient. European agricultural ideology favored wheat fields, cattle ranches, and land consolidation. An indigenous infinite food system did not align with colonial economic priorities. So it faded, not because it failed, because it didn't fit the new power structure. Yet fragments survived. Even today, in parts of modern Mexico City, remnants of Chinampa agriculture still operate, especially in Xochimilco. Farmers still dredge canals, still rotate crops, still harvest multiple yields annually. UNESCO recognizes the region for its cultural and ecological importance. Which raises a haunting question. If this 2,400-year-old system was so productive, so sustainable, so resilient, why did the industrial world abandon it in favor of soil-depleting monoculture? And more importantly, could it solve modern food crises today? Because we are now facing soil degradation, water shortages, fertilizer dependency, and climate instability. Industrial agriculture feeds billions, but at massive ecological cost. Topsoil erosion, nitrogen runoff, dead zones in oceans, fossil fuel dependence, global supply chain vulnerability. Meanwhile, an ancient system once fed a megacity sustainably for centuries. Was it truly infinite? Not magical, not endless in a literal sense, but self-renewing, and that might be even more powerful. Because the so-called infinite food system wasn't primitive improvisation. It wasn't accidental abundance. It was a carefully engineered, hydrological masterpiece built on ecological mathematics long before modern agricultural science existed. And when researchers finally began studying the remains seriously in the 20th century, the numbers shocked them. To understand why, we need to step back into the Valley of Mexico, a high-altitude basin surrounded by mountains, once filled with interconnected lakes. This wasn't an easy environment to farm. The water was brackish in some areas. Flooding was seasonal. Rainfall varied. Traditional dry field agriculture would have struggled to support a dense urban population. So instead of fighting the water, they built with it. The Chinampa system functioned as a living machine. Each rectangular plot was typically around 30 meters long and 2 to 4 meters wide, separated by canals just wide enough for canoe transport. The narrow width wasn't random. It allowed farmers to reach the center of the field from either side without stepping on crops, minimizing soil compaction. Even modern regenerative agriculture emphasizes minimizing compaction. They understood this instinctively. But here's where it gets more advanced. The canals were not just transport routes. They were nutrient engines. Organic waste from the city, plant scraps, human waste that had been composted, animal remains, could be cycled back into the system. Sediment rich in nitrogen and phosphorus accumulated naturally in canal bottoms. Farmers dredged this mud and layered it onto fields. This constant renewal prevented nutrient depletion, one of the greatest weaknesses of conventional farming. In industrial agriculture, synthetic fertilizer is required because soil is stripped year after year. In the Chinampa model, the lake itself became the fertilizer factory. Closed loop, self-repairing, self-feeding. Modern soil scientists analyzing surviving Chinampa plots near Mexico City found something remarkable. The soil profile showed continuous enrichment over centuries rather than depletion. The structure was dark, loose, highly organic, comparable to premium compost-rich soil today. Even more stunning, productivity estimates suggest Chinampas could produce up to 3 to 7 harvests per year depending on crop rotation. Maize could be grown alongside beans and squash, the famous Mesoamerican, Three Sisters, Polyculture, creating natural nitrogen fixation cycles. Beans restored nitrogen, squash shaded soil to reduce evaporation. Maize provided structure for climbing vines. This wasn't monoculture, it was ecological symbiosis. And because canals moderated temperature, crops were less vulnerable to frost. Water retains heat. At night, it slowly released warmth into the surrounding air. This created microclimates, protecting plants from sudden temperature drops. In other words, they engineered climate control. 2,400 years ago, when Spanish forces led by Hernán Cortés entered Tenochtitlan, they described causeways stretching across shimmering water, markets filled with fresh produce, flowers stacked in colorful pyramids, and a city so clean and organized that some compared it favorably to European capitals. This abundance wasn't luck, it was infrastructure, and infrastructure equals power, which brings us to the uncomfortable part of the story. After the conquest, the Spanish began draining the lakes, especially Lake Texcoco, to prevent flooding and reshape the region according to European urban design principles. Large drainage projects continued for centuries. Water levels dropped, wetlands disappeared, Chinampa networks shrank. Officially, this was about flood control and modernization. But economically, wetland-based community farming didn't align with colonial land systems. European models favored centralized estates, livestock grazing, and export crops like wheat. Chinampas empowered small-scale indigenous farmers. They reduced dependence on imported grain. They created food sovereignty. And food sovereignty reduces political control. There's no surviving royal decree that says, ban the infinite food system. History is rarely that direct. Instead, suppression happened through environmental restructuring, land redistribution, and cultural displacement. As water receded, the system physically weakened. As indigenous communities were reorganized under colonial rule, traditional knowledge fragmented. A system doesn't have to be outlawed to be erased. It only has to be made inconvenient. Fast forward centuries. Industrial agriculture emerges in Europe and North America. Mechanization, chemical fertilizers, monoculture, massive scale, global trade networks. Productivity skyrockets, but so do ecological costs. Soil erosion accelerates. Rivers become polluted with nitrogen runoff. Biodiversity collapses. Meanwhile, in small pockets south of modern Mexico City, farmers in Xochimilco quietly continue maintaining fragments of the old system. Then researchers arrive. In the 1970s and 1980s, anthropologists and agricultural scientists began re-evaluating Chinampas not as relics, but as models. Some pilot restoration projects demonstrated extraordinary yield potential using traditional methods. Comparative studies suggested that per hectare, Chinampas could rival or exceed many forms of conventional farming, especially when diversity of crops is considered rather than a single commodity output. And here's where it becomes controversial. If decentralized, low-energy, high-yield wetland farming is viable, what does that mean for industrial fertilizer companies? For large-scale monocrop agribusiness? For global supply chains built on export dependency? The Chinampa model doesn't require massive fertilizer inputs. It doesn't require heavy machinery. It doesn't depend on patented seeds. It doesn't rely on fossil fuel-based irrigation pumps. It relies on ecological literacy. And ecological literacy is difficult to commodify. Now imagine scaling this concept, not necessarily by rebuilding ancient lakes, but by adapting the principles: regenerative nutrient cycling, polyculture, integrated aquaculture, microclimate engineering. Some modern urban farming movements are unknowingly rediscovering these ideas. Aquaponics systems echo Chinampa logic. Regenerative agriculture mirrors its soil philosophy. Wetland restoration projects highlight similar productivity advantages. But the original blueprint already existed for over 2 millennia. So why isn't it mainstream? Because modern agriculture optimizes for single crop yield per commodity market, not ecosystem resilience. Because financial systems reward export volume, not soil health. Because policy often favors consolidation over community-scale production. And because we tend to believe that ancient equals primitive. But what if ancient equals optimized for survival? Here's the deeper irony. Today, climate change is increasing flood risks in many regions. Rising water tables, heavier rainfall events, unpredictable seasons. Modern agriculture often collapses under extreme weather. Fields flood, crops rot, supply chains stall. Chinampas were built for wetlands. They thrived in shallow water. Flood wasn't disaster, it was maintenance. The very conditions we now fear were once integrated into food production design. Which forces a radical question. Did we abandon resilience for scale? We've seen how the Chinampa system fed a megacity. We've seen how it engineered nature instead of fighting it. Now comes the final question, the one that matters most. Could this 2,400-year-old, infinite food system feed the modern world? Because today, the crisis is no longer hypothetical. Topsoil is disappearing faster than it forms. Industrial farming has degraded vast areas of land. Synthetic fertilizers, heavily dependent on fossil fuels, dominate global food production. Rivers carry nutrient runoff into oceans, creating dead zones the size of small countries. Climate change increases floods in some regions, droughts in others. Supply chains stretch across continents, vulnerable to war, pandemics, and political instability. And yet, hidden in the wetlands of ancient Mesoamerica, was a model that solved many of these problems centuries ago. Let's imagine something radical. Instead of draining wetlands, we restore them. Instead of flattening ecosystems into monocultures, we design multi-layered food systems. Instead of separating cities from agriculture, we integrate them. This isn't fantasy, it's adaptation of principles. The Chinampa system, perfected under the ancestors of what became the Aztec Empire, operated on 5 key pillars. Continuous nutrient cycling, polyculture instead of monoculture, water as climate regulator, community scale management, decentralized food sovereignty. Modern researchers studying remnants near Mexico City have documented that traditional Chinampas can still produce remarkable yields per hectare, especially when crop diversity is included in the calculation rather than a single commodity metric. Some restoration projects show that small plots can generate multiple annual harvests without synthetic fertilizer. Now scale that thinking forward. Imagine coastal cities adapting wetland farming belts to buffer sea level rise. Imagine flood-prone regions converting excess water zones into productive agricultural corridors. Imagine urban food systems reducing transport emissions by growing high-yield produce locally. The ancient engineers of Tenochtitlan understood something modern urban planners often ignore: cities and ecosystems cannot be separated without consequence. But here's where reality gets complicated. Rebuilding large-scale Chinampa-style systems would require major land use restructuring. Many former lake regions have been paved over. Water tables have shifted. Pollution contaminates waterways. Restoring wetlands in dense urban environments is politically and economically complex. And there are powerful interests invested in maintaining the current agricultural paradigm. Industrial agriculture is deeply tied to global fertilizer production, large-scale seed companies, mechanized equipment manufacturers, commodity trading markets, and export-based national economies. The system is optimized for scale and uniformity. Chinampa logic is optimized for resilience and diversity. Those are not the same incentives. It's not that there's a secret global ban preventing ancient wetland farming from returning. There is no single law outlawing Chinampas. The ban was structural, created through drainage projects, urban expansion, colonial land systems, and later industrial modernization policies that simply favored different models. When Hernán Cortés oversaw the destruction of Tenochtitlan, the city's lake-based infrastructure was dismantled. Over centuries, Lake Texcoco was progressively drained. What was once a thriving hydrological food web became urban sprawl. You don't need to outlaw a system if you remove the water it depends on. But here's the twist. In the 21st century, as climate instability accelerates, scientists are beginning to re-evaluate ancient ecological knowledge systems worldwide. Not as curiosities, but as climate adaptation strategies. Wetlands, once dismissed as wastelands, are now recognized as carbon sinks. Biodiverse farming systems are shown to be more resilient to pests and extreme weather. Regenerative agriculture is gaining traction. Urban farming movements are expanding. Aquaponics systems mirror the integrated water and crop logic of Chinampas. In many ways, we are slowly reinventing what already existed. But reinvention often lacks the cultural continuity that made the original system sustainable. Chinampas were not just agricultural structures. They were embedded in community governance, ritual cycles, and shared maintenance responsibilities. Food production was social infrastructure. That might be the hardest part to restore. Modern cities are centralized and economically stratified. Food production is often invisible to urban populations. Supermarkets replace local markets. Global imports replace seasonal diversity. Chinampas systems required intimate knowledge of water flow, sediment quality, crop rotation timing, and cooperative labor. It was a knowledge ecosystem, not just a farming technique. So could it feed modern megacities? Not alone, but its principles could transform them. Imagine a hybrid future: regenerative wetland belts around flood-prone cities, integrated aquaculture with vegetable production, localized food hubs reducing dependence on long-distance imports, nutrient recycling systems that turn organic waste back into soil fertility. The ancient world achieved this without satellite weather forecasting, without tractors, without chemical fertilizer. They achieved it through observation, through adaptation, through designing with nature instead of against it. The real lesson of the so-called infinite food system is not that it produced endless calories. Nothing in nature is truly infinite. The power was in renewal, in building a system that replenished itself as it fed a population. That's what made it feel infinite. And perhaps that's what made it threatening to later power structures. It reduced dependence on centralized control. Today, we face a paradox. We produce more food globally than ever before, yet hunger persists. We have advanced agricultural technology, yet soil health declines. We drain wetlands for development, then spend billions on flood defenses. 2,400 years ago, an indigenous civilization designed a food system that blurred the line between city and ecosystem, waste and fertility, water and land. It wasn't perfect. It required maintenance. It was regionally specific, but it worked, for centuries. And when the Spanish chroniclers first saw the floating gardens surrounding Tenochtitlan, they did not describe scarcity. They described abundance. So maybe the question isn't why the system was banned. Maybe the real question is why we forgot. Because the blueprint still exists. In fragments near Mexico City, in historical records, in soil layers beneath modern streets, and in the memory of communities who never fully abandoned it. The world is searching for sustainable food solutions. Perhaps the future isn't ahead of us. Perhaps it was floating quietly on a lake, 2,400 years ago.